April 1945. Europe was collapsing in fire and ash cities broken under weeks of bombardment, fields turned to mud, and the air thick with the stench of defeat. Along a dirt road in the Rhineland, a column of German women shuffled behind barbed wire, guarded by foreign soldiers whose clipped English commands sounded sharp and alien. Their bodies told the story of years of deprivation, shoes held together with string skirts patched and frayed faces hollowed by hunger. They had heard the rumors whispered in the ruins the Americans would starve them, humiliate them, strip away the last shred of dignity. Every glance was wary, every step burdened by dread, as if they were already bracing for the cruelty to come. Then the order rang out. You'll be processed, deloused showers. The word hung heavy, echoing in their minds with terrible meaning. For many, showers did not mean cleansing, but death. They had heard of the east of water that was not water. Fear spread like fire down the line. Some women clutching each other's arms, others whispering prayers, their eyes fixed on the low wooden building ahead, where steam curled faintly into the cold air. The door opened, and what awaited was not gas, but water rushing hot and real. It poured across blistered skin and tangled hair, carrying away the filth of years. Soap slipped into their hands. Thick towels followed soft against bodies long accustomed to rags. For the first time in memory, they were not treated as enemies to be broken, but as human beings allowed to feel warmth. In that moment, the women trembled, not from fear, but from a mercy they could not understand. Was this fleeting kindness, or the first crack in the lies that war had built? The question lingered heavier than the steam that filled the room. April 1945. Europe was collapsing into smoke and silence, a continent crumbling under the weight of a war that had lasted too long and consumed too much. The front lines were breaking, cities smoldered like open graves, and villages lay scattered in ruins. Every road carried the echo of retreating boots. Every sky was scored by the streak of departing aircraft. Every river seemed swollen, not only with spring rains, but with the grief of a dying empire. For those still trapped in its final convulsions, the collapse was not a moment of relief, not an ending, but a suffocating descent into uncertainty. The air smelled of ash and hunger, and the world itself seemed to stagger beneath the burden of despair. Down a battered road in the Rhineland, a column of German women moved slowly beneath the eyes of armed guards. Barbed wire fenced them in, and wooden towers loomed above with silhouettes of soldiers outlined against the gray sky. Their footsteps were uneven, dragging their bodies bent under invisible weights. Some were farmers' daughters, pulled from the fields. Others had worked as nurses or clerks, all of them now reduced to the same march of captivity. Their clothing clung in rags, jackets patched until the fabric gave way, boots split wide and held together with rope or strips of cloth. A few no longer had shoes at all and stumbled forward, barefoot, skin cracked and bleeding against the gravel. Faces hollowed by years of rationing revealed more than exhaustion. They revealed the slow erosion of identity. Cheeks had caved in, lips were split, eyes ringed with shadows that spoke of nights without sleep and days without bread. Dirt and soot clung to their skin like a second layer, and the air around them carried the odor of sweat, fear, and deprivation. These were not soldiers anymore. Not workers or mothers or daughters as they had once been, but figures stripped to their most fragile selves, walking under the weight of a future they could not see. Whispers darted between them, carried in nervous German murmurs too quiet for the guards to catch. The rumors they had heard before, surrender followed them here like ghosts. Americans would not treat them with dignity. The Americans would starve them, humiliate them, reduce them to animals in cages. Worse still, some whispered darker things, that surrender meant degradation far beyond hunger, that captivity would be another word for cruelty. They had believed these warnings because fear left no space for hope, and so they walked with eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in, waiting for the next blow that surely must come. The world around them seemed emptied of color. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with smoke from burned villages. The fields, once green with spring, were scarred by shell craters and blackened trees. Even the air tasted of ash. Silence pressed hard against them, broken only by the scrape of boots on gravel and the clipped foreign syllables of their guards. English orders carried no warmth. only sharp efficiency words that cut across the line and made them quicken their steps. One girl, hardly 17, clenched her fists so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She was trembling, but not from cold. Her memories of home were fading, her mother's voice, her father's laughter, all replaced now by the grinding rhythm of captivity. Another woman, older, her hair streaked with gray, and her coat no more than a tattered blanket, stared straight ahead, without blinking, as if to surrender to despair was the only way to keep moving. Each carried within them the unspoken thought, whatever awaited beyond those gates could not be mercy. The barbed wire closed around them like a noose stretching into the distance until it vanished at the edge of vision. Behind it, the world felt different. Here the language was strange, the uniforms bore no swastikas, and the silence was heavier. When the gates clanged shut, the sound echoed deep inside them, sealing off not just escape, but perhaps the last trace of who they had been. The women's stiffened hearts, pounding breaths shallow. They were now at the mercy of the very enemy they had been taught to fear above all others. In that moment, a silence deeper than the clamor of battle spread through the line. It was not the silence of peace, but of anticipation of dread. They had endured hunger, cold, and bombardment. But this was different. This was the unknown, and the unknown always felt heavier than chains. The guards gave brisk instructions through interpreters. Names were taken, lines formed, documents checked. The women obeyed their movements, stiff, their eyes flicking from face to face as though searching for a sign of cruelty. Yet no blows came, no insults were hurled. Still, no one dared to believe. Fear was a habit too deeply carved into their bones. As the sun sank, lower shadows stretching long across the compound, the line of women paused before a low building from which a faint curl of steam drifted into the air. The scent that reached them was sharp, alien, almost clean. It was not the smoke of destruction, not the stench of rot, but something medicinal, something they could not name. They glanced at one another, puzzled, uncertain. A word passed down the line, spoken in English, repeated in German with trembling lips. Showers. The sound of it froze them. It was a word heavy with terrible meaning, a word that twisted their fear tighter around their hearts. Some gasped, some pressed hands to mouths, some whispered in panic. They had heard the stories of the East, the rumors of places where showers did not mean cleansing but death. Whether they had believed them once or not no longer mattered. In this moment, the word alone was enough to make them shiver as though death's shadow had fallen across the line. The women stood there in the fading light, caught between exhaustion and terror, each heartbeat thudding loud in the silence. And though none of them yet knew it, the moment would mark the threshold between everything they had been taught to expect and everything they were about to discover. The line moved slowly, each woman stepping forward as if toward her own execution. The word showers still echoed in their ears like the crack of a rifle. When the first group was ushered inside, the rest held their breath, waiting for screams that never came. The building swallowed the women, and for a moment, silence pressed down heavier than any chain. Then the guards motioned again, and more prisoners were pushed through the doorway. The air inside was warmer than the April chill outside. Steam curled faintly against the wooden planks, and the smell grew stronger, sharp, soapy, unfamiliar. Fear clung to them as tightly as their rags, and each step was a struggle between obedience and the instinct to run. But where could they run? The barbed wire was everywhere. A girl, no older than 17, stood at the threshold. Her hair hung in greasy ropes, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. She tilted her head upward, staring at the pipes running along the ceiling. For a long second, she froze her lungs too tight to draw breath. Then, with a sudden rush of sound, water gushed from the nozzles above, striking the tiled floor in a spray. The girl stumbled backward, a gasp tearing from her throat. She clutched her chest as though burned. Around her, other women recoiled, pressing themselves against the wall, their eyes wild with terror. Every rumor they had heard seemed to leap alive in that instant. They were certain the end had come. But no choking gas filled the air. No invisible death clawed at their throats. Instead, the water splashed warm against the floor. spreading in small rivers around their blistered feet. Tentatively, almost against her will, the young girl stretched out a hand. A few drops struck her fingertips. She jerked away at first, then slowly reached out again, her palm trembling as the warmth sank into her skin. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened. It was not scalding. It was not poison. It was water clean hot flowing in a steady cascade. She let out a broken sob that startled even herself. Tears blurred her vision as she stepped beneath the stream, the water pouring over her scalp, cutting rivulets through the dirt, loosening knots of hair that had clung together for weeks. She pressed both hands against her face, her shoulders shaking not from cold but from something deeper, something she could not name. Relief. Survival. The staggering realization that she was alive. Others followed, timid at first, then with growing desperation. The room filled with the sound of water striking tile, of gasps and muffled sobs. Women who had not bathed in months leaned into the stream, letting it run down their spines, their arms, their legs. Dirt melted from their bodies in brown streaks swirling across the floor toward the drains. The scent of soap filled the air as blocks were handed out, smooth and pale, slippery in hands calloused from labor. Some women rubbed it across their skin with frantic energy, as though trying to erase the years of filth in one moment. Others held it reverently, inhaling its scent, afraid it might vanish if used too quickly. The atmosphere, once paralyzed by dread, began to shift. The silence of terror cracked open, replaced by sounds that had not been heard among them in years. Sighs of relief, soft laughter, the fragile hum of disbelief. A woman bent to wash her hair, her fingers tangling through the strands, and when she lifted her head, the water streamed down her cheeks like tears. Another, older and gaunt, leaned her forehead against the cool tile, her lips moving silently as though in prayer. The young girl who had first stepped forward whispered words that carried across the room. "We are not dead. We are not dead." Her voice trembled, but it was steady enough to reach the others. One woman broke down completely, her sobs rising above the splash of water, and instead of recoiling in fear, the sound rippled through the others like release. The room became alive, with breath-sharp intakes, shuddering exhales, the long-held air of dread finally escaping. Steam clouded the air, softening the harsh edges of the walls, cloaking the women in a kind of fragile veil. They rubbed their arms, their faces, their bellies, rediscovering the texture of their own skin. Scars long hidden beneath layers of dirt revealed themselves, but the sight of them no longer stung as much as the realization that beneath all the wounds and grime, they were still whole, still human. Some women laughed shakily, almost afraid of the sound in their own throats. Others pressed the soap to their noses and wept quietly, overwhelmed by something so simple it felt like a miracle. The room had begun as a chamber of terror, but now it pulsed with the rhythm of life returning. Warmth seeped into their bones. The fear that had chained their lungs loosened, replaced by something unfamiliar yet undeniable relief. In a single rush of water, the image of their captors as merciless monsters had cracked, if only slightly. They could not yet call it kindness, could not yet believe in mercy, but they could feel the undeniable truth of the moment. They were alive, and the warmth of the water told them so. When the streams finally slowed and the last drops fell, the women stood in silence once more. But it was no longer the silence of dread. It was the silence of exhaustion, mingled with astonishment, the silence of those who had stared at death and found instead the unbearable gift of life. The air was heavy with steam, and the floor slick with water and dirt. But within their hearts, something fragile flickered. For the first time in years, hope felt possible. They had expected chains, hunger, and humiliation. Yet, when the streams of water finally ceased and the women stood dripping on the wet floor, something else awaited them. The guards, indifferent in their expressions, began handing out small blocks of soap and folded towels stacked high on wooden tables. At first, the prisoners did not move. Their eyes, wide and uncertain, flicked from the pale bars of soap to the faces of the soldiers, suspicious that this too was some cruel trick. Then one woman, trembling, reached out. The bar slid into her palm, smooth white, stamped with a foreign word. It was solid, clean, and strangely heavy. For years they had known only gray substitutes that dissolved into greasy scum. Here was something different, something almost luxurious. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled. The scent was sharp, fatty, clean in a way that made her throat tighten. She pressed it to her lips without realizing, as if afraid the air might steal it away. The towels came next. Thick, soft, real cloth that absorbed water instead of scraping skin raw. When the first prisoner pressed the folded fabric against her face, her knees nearly buckled. Tears broke loose. She buried her cheeks into the cotton and sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. Others followed, clutching the towels to their chests as if they had been given relics from a sacred place. The room moments ago filled with the hiss of water and gasps of relief now overflowed with a different sound, muffled, weeping, the kind that comes not from pain, but from an unbearable kindness too fragile to believe. One woman, no more than 20, broke her bar of soap into 2 pieces. With trembling fingers, she tucked half into the torn pocket of her blouse, hiding it against her chest, as if it were gold. For tomorrow, she whispered, to no one, to everyone. Her voice cracked, her eyes glistening with a terror that the miracle would vanish by morning. Around her, others rubbed the soap along their arms, creating a lather that slipped like silk across their skin. They watched the bubbles form, stared at their hands as though they belonged to strangers. Each bubble felt like proof that they had not been erased by the war, that there was still softness left in the world. Softness they had forgotten how to touch. Shame lingered even in this moment. To feel joy in captivity seemed wrong, a betrayal of everything they had been told, to expect a betrayal of those still suffering beyond the wire. And yet, as the towels dried their hair, as the soap slid between their fingers, something within them shifted. The humiliation of stripping, of standing naked before guards, of being reduced to numbers and files began to dissolve under the weight of something stronger. They felt their own humanity return in the most ordinary of things. It was unbearable in its simplicity. Not speeches, not promises, not victories, but water, soap, and cloth. A prisoner named Hana, whose husband had died in the Pacific and who had been dragged from her small town near Nagasaki only weeks before, whispered to the woman beside her, "I thought I would never feel clean again." Her voice shook as she clutched the towel, pressing it hard into her face, as if to memorize the texture forever. The other woman nodded mutely, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to answer. Both stood there, wrapped in fabric, softer than anything they had touched in years, each realizing that in this moment, survival meant not only the absence of death, but the presence of dignity. The guards looked on without comment. To them it was routine, unremarkable. Soap was cheap, towels were standard issue. But for the prisoners, every thread, every scent, every touch was a miracle that cracked the armor of despair they had worn for too long. They whispered to one another in disbelief, comparing the feel of the fabric, the way the soap smelled, the way their hair no longer clung in oily strands, but lay soft against their cheeks. Their laughter, fragile and uncertain, began to ripple through the room. It was laughter tinged with grief, with memory, with the staggering awareness that life could still hold tenderness. And so what began as humiliation slowly transformed into resurrection. In the folds of those towels and the scent of those bars of soap, the women found pieces of themselves they thought had been lost forever. They held on to them with desperation, clutching them close to their bodies, afraid to let go. In those small, ordinary objects, they discovered something extraordinary, the reminder that they were still human, that their bodies still deserved warmth, that even in the darkest corridors of captivity, mercy could come, not in grand gestures, but in the smallest, simplest gifts. At first they told themselves it was only a trick of mercy, a moment granted once and then stolen back. The warmth of that shower, the softness of the towel, the scent of soap that lingered on their skin, it all felt too fragile to last. They fell asleep that night, clutching fragments of it in their memories, afraid it would fade by morning. Some whispered in the dark barracks that it could not happen again, that tomorrow would bring punishment instead. Others lay silently, pressing stolen scraps of soap against their noses, breathing in the reminder that for 1 hour they had been more than prisoners. When the morning came, the clang of metal on metal jolted them awake. Buckets rattled, boots scraped against gravel, and the familiar bark of orders cut through the air. They braced for harshness. But then through the hum of English words they barely understood, one command was clear. Showers. The line formed again, hesitant at first, women exchanging uncertain glances. It could not be real, they thought. It could not be repeated. Yet as they stepped once more toward the low building with its curling steam, they realized the impossible yesterday had not been a dream. The pipes hissed, the faucets turned, and again the water rushed down in hot streams. For a heartbeat they froze, as though fearing it would change to something deadly. But then the warmth spread across their backs, down their arms, over their faces. It was true. It was real. A second time, and this time the fear melted faster. They leaned into it, their bodies greedy for the sensation. Fingers stiff from frost, uncurled under the heat. Muscles clenched for years under hardship began to loosen. The sound in the room shifted. Yesterday, it had been gasps of disbelief. Today, it was sighs, deep and heavy, the sound of burdens sliding from weary shoulders. Day by day, the ritual repeated. Not always at the same hour, not always with perfect order, but enough to mark the rhythm of their captivity. With each passing day, change became visible. Skin that had been gray and blistered began to soften, rashes faded, and the crawling itch of lice diminished. Hair that had been matted and greasy slowly shone, with health brushing softly against cheeks once hollow. Cheeks themselves sharpened by hunger began to regain faint curves of life. Eyes that had stared out dull and empty now glimmered with something fragile, a light not seen in years. It was not only their bodies that transformed. Something stirred in their spirits, something even more startling than the return of health. At first, it was subtle, a woman humming under her breath as she dried her hair, a fleeting smile as another inhaled the scent of soap. Then it grew. A burst of laughter slipped out when one woman wrapped herself clumsily in a towel too big for her. Another time, a splash of water drew giggles that echoed strangely in the tiled room. The guards glanced over, puzzled, but did not silence them. Within the barracks, the changes spread. Conversations no longer carried, only whispers of fear. Instead, voices softened, stories re-emerged, even jokes surfaced, the fragile rebuilding of community. They had thought laughter belonged only to the past, buried with the lives they had lost. To hear it rise again within those fences was almost unbearable. One evening, as the women lay on straw mattresses, a ripple of soft laughter drifted across the room, and a hush followed. Not the hush of fear, but the hush of reverence. It was as though they were afraid to disturb it, this fragile, miraculous sound they thought would never return. For a long while no one spoke, and in that silence their hearts swelled with the ache of hope. Yet with each new shower came a sharper contrast. How could it be, they wondered, that their enemies offered them this dignity when their own leaders had left them in filth? They wrestled with the question in silence, unable to reconcile what they had been told with what they now lived. The shame of it cut deep. Some muttered warnings not to let kindness weaken them. Others resisted believing it was kindness at all. But each day, when the water streamed hot and steady, when the towels pressed soft against their damp hair, those doubts wavered. For the Americans, it was routine. Soldiers grumbled when the water turned lukewarm, cursed when towels were scratchy, laughed at the thought that soap could bring anyone to tears. But for the women behind the wire, every drop of water carried weight, every towel felt sacred. They cherished them with desperation, clutching them as if clinging to life itself. And in that desperation was a quiet rebirth, as if each shower washed away not only dirt but despair. The repetition turned fear into expectation, expectation into relief, relief into something dangerously close to joy. They began to count their days, not in hours of hunger or nights of cold, but in the rhythm of steam and soap. It became the fragile thread that tied them to existence. And in that thread, laughter returned first, hesitant, then freer, echoing through the compound, in defiance of everything the war had tried to destroy. In those moments of warmth, they felt themselves alive again, Not soldiers, not enemies, not prisoners, but simply women, rediscovering what it meant to be human. Beyond the fences, the world they had once called home was unraveling. News trickled into the camp in whispers, carried by new arrivals and fragments of letters intercepted in rumors too terrible to ignore. Japan, their homeland, was burning. Cities had been turned into oceans of fire. Mothers and children scoured the ruins for scraps of food, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Hunger stalked the countryside like a shadow, forcing families to dig for roots or strip bark from trees just to keep breathing. The sound of bombers overhead had become as familiar as the tolling of church bells, and each raid left another wound carved into the earth. The women listened in silence, their hearts tightening, unable to reconcile the images of devastation with the steam that curled around their faces each morning. Inside the barbed wire, they were captives, stripped of freedom, watched at every turn. Yet in this strange contradiction, they found themselves touching things their own people had long since lost. Soap that lathered in their hands like clouds, towels that absorbed water and pressed soft against their skin, hot water that ran without ration or fear of interruption. They were enemies, prisoners of war, yet here they were made clean, treated with a routine care that civilians outside the fences could not imagine. It was a mercy they had not expected, and its gentleness cut deeper than cruelty ever could. One evening, as the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, an older officer sat hunched over his hands, rough and trembling. His voice was no more than a whisper, but every ear strained to catch it. "Do you see the irony?" he murmured. "We are given dignity by the enemy, while our own government left us in the dirt." His words cracked in the air, not with anger, but with a sorrow so heavy it felt like stone. No one answered. They could not. The truth of it pressed against them all, suffocating in its clarity. In that moment, silence was their only confession. The paradox became harder to ignore with each passing day. The women remembered how at home soap had disappeared from ration lines years before, replaced by gray substitutes that left skin raw. Towels, when they could be found, were coarse rags that scratched instead of soothed. Hot water was a dream reserved for the wealthy, or for hospitals clinging to their last reserves. Families had bathed in cold buckets, shivering in half-dark rooms, scrubbing with hands that smelled of earth and smoke. Children had gone to sleep unwashed for weeks at a time. Yet here, behind barbed wire, the enemy provided what their own leaders could not, or would not. Each time they rubbed soap across their arms. Each time they wrapped themselves in the softness of a towel, shame twisted alongside relief. The shame was not born from captivity alone, but from the realization that the war had stolen their humanity long before the Americans took their freedom. Their leaders had told them to sacrifice, to endure, to obey. They had been promised honor and victory, yet what they were left with was hunger, filth, and silence. To discover that dignity had come not from their homeland, but from the very hands of their enemies, was a wound that cut straight through pride. For some, it was unbearable. One woman pressed her face into the folds of her towel and wept until the fabric was soaked, whispering between sobs that it smelled like her mother's hands. Another hid her bar of soap under her mattress, clutching it at night as though it could anchor her to something beyond despair. Yet each act of tenderness from their captors, whether intentional or indifferent, forced them to confront the lies they had swallowed for years. The enemy was not the monster they had been told to hate. The monster was the emptiness left by those who had abandoned them. The irony seeped into every corner of their thoughts. The guards laughed, smoked cigarettes, and treated hot water as nothing more than routine grumbling when it ran cold. For them, it was ordinary. For the women, it was salvation. They wondered how their lives had narrowed so far that a bar of soap could feel like a gift greater than freedom. But the truth was undeniable. These small mercies revealed the hollowness of everything they had once believed. And so day after day, the contradiction deepened. Outside the wire, their people scavenged weeds for soup. Their children grew gaunt with hunger. Their houses lay in ruins beneath smoldering skies. Inside, the prisoners bathed in steam and dried themselves with cotton that felt like clouds. The contrast was a wound that no medicine could heal, a scar not on their skin but in their souls. The old officer's words lingered in their minds, echoing long after he had spoken them. "We are given dignity by the enemy, while our own abandoned us." In those words was a grief more piercing than chains, a humiliation sharper than the sting of captivity. It was the knowledge that their suffering had not been necessary, that the war had devoured them not because their enemies hated them, but because their leaders had betrayed them. This was the paradox that haunted them most. That within the very heart of their defeat in the hands of their conquerors, they had found a mercy greater than any shown by those who once demanded their loyalty. It was a mercy that restored them piece by piece, yet also reminded them of all they had lost. And in that contradiction lay a pain heavier than hunger, deeper than fear, and more lasting than any chain that bound them. The showers became more than cleansing. They became ritual. Each day the women lined up hesitantly at first. Then, with growing eagerness, their bare feet shuffling across the gravel toward the low building, where steam curled into the sky. What had begun as terror now carried the rhythm of survival. Their bodies, once starved of warmth, began to anticipate the embrace of water. Shoulders stiff from years of tension loosened, fingers bent from cold uncurled beneath the heat. Their laughter, timid at first, returned like a melody half forgotten rising in the tiled room where only sobs had echoed before. For the Americans it was nothing. Routine. The guards leaned against walls smoking, muttering jokes, trading shifts with a sigh. Hot water was expected, soap, an afterthought, towels, something they cursed when they were scratchy. They could not fathom what it meant to the prisoners who pressed the towels to their faces as if they had been given silk spun from heaven. To the soldiers it was just supply. To the prisoners it was salvation. The women cherished each detail, each small fragment of mercy. They would lift the soap to their noses before washing, inhaling deeply, memorizing the scent as though it could anchor them in time. Some hid slivers of it under their mattresses, holding them tight in fists as they slept. Towels, once returned, left a ghostly memory on their cheeks, a softness that lingered long after the fabric was gone. The steam became sacred. It curled around them like a veil, blurring the walls, dissolving the fences for one fragile hour, reminding them that they were human beings and not shadows condemned to disappear. Health returned quietly, but unmistakably. Skin cleared of sores. Hair shone with a faint luster. Their eyes brightened, no longer dulled by despair. More than the body, it was the spirit that healed. Quarrels faded. Murmurs of defiance softened. For the first time since the war had swept them into captivity, they felt not only alive but dignified. And dignity, after years of being stripped away, was the most dangerous gift of all because it made them remember who they had been. At night in the barracks, they whispered about the water. Not about battles lost or bombs that had fallen, but about the warmth of the stream, the lather of soap, the touch of the towels. One woman said the smell reminded her of her childhood when her mother would scrub her hair by the fire. Another said the softness of the cotton felt like the first dress she had ever sewn as a girl. Each spoke not of war, but of memory awakened by simple mercies. The war had sought to erase them, but these small rituals stitched pieces of their lives back together. Still, guilt hovered in the air. They knew their families back home lived without such mercies. Japan was burning children, starved mothers searched rubble for food. Here within barbed wire they had hot water. It was a paradox that tore at them. To feel cleaner, healthier, more human in captivity than their own kin did in freedom was a wound invisible but deep. Some could not bear it. They pressed their towels to their faces and wept, not from gratitude but from shame. Yet even in shame they clung to the ritual, because to reject it would be to deny the fragile thread that kept them alive. The guards could not see what they had given. To them it was efficiency. Clean prisoners spread, less disease caused less trouble. To the women it was rebirth, disguised as routine. Each shower was more than water. It was memory remade. Every drop whispered, "You are alive, you are more than what war has tried to make of you." And so day by day their souls crushed under years of fear and hunger began to lift. Years later, when the war was over and some of the women returned to the ruins of their homeland, it was not the battles they spoke of first. Not the sound of bombs screaming overhead, nor the hunger that had gnawed at their stomachs. Instead, they spoke of steam, of soap, of towels, soft against skin. They told their children and grandchildren of the miracle of hot water falling from pipes, of the smell of ivory soap, of the way laughter had returned in a room once filled with terror. They remembered not victory or defeat, but the smallest mercies that had reminded them they were human when everything else had tried to strip that truth away. One survivor, interviewed decades later, said simply, "They took everything from us. Hope, pride, freedom. But then, they gave us a towel, and in that towel I felt human again." Her voice cracked with age, but her eyes filled with tears, because even 50 years later, the memory of cotton against her face had not faded. This was the paradox of war, that humanity could be rediscovered not in speeches or treaties, not in guns or victories, but in the ordinary kindness of water, soap, and cloth. In captivity, the enemy had offered them what their own leaders had denied: dignity. And in that dignity, a truth far greater than propaganda revealed itself. The showers remained in their memory like a hymn. Each drop of water had been a rebellion against despair. Each towel an unspoken promise that even in war tenderness could survive. They carried it through the years, through the silence of rebuilding, through the grief of all that was lost. And when words failed them, they would close their eyes and remember the warmth, the lather, the softness. In the end, that was what endured. Not the roar of bombs or the speeches of generals, but the miracle of a bar of soap, the hush of steam, the embrace of a towel. In the heart of war, where cruelty had become ordinary, it was these fragile mercies that defined their humanity. And so the story closed with a contradiction too sharp to forget, that in a world shattered by violence, the truest reminder of what it meant to be alive was not the clash of steel or the crack of rifles, but the quiet cascade of hot water falling on weary shoulders, a simple, astonishing gift, a single drop of warmth that defied the darkness. When we look back at April 1945, when Europe collapsed under the weight of war and Japan braced itself for devastation, it is not only the battles and the bombs that remain in memory. It is also the quiet, almost unnoticeable moments where humanity broke through the walls of hatred. The story of those Japanese prisoners who expected cruelty, but instead found hot water, soap, and towels, reminds us of the strange paradoxes of war. While their homeland burned under firebombs and their families suffered hunger, they captives behind barbed wire were given the smallest mercies that carried the greatest meaning. These moments did not erase their pain, but they gave them back something essential, of the dignity of being human. It is striking to realize that what transformed their lives in captivity was not speeches, not victories, not weapons, but the simple cascade of warm water, the scent of soap, the softness of a towel. For the guards, it was routine. For the prisoners, it was nothing less than a miracle. These small mercies became a ritual, a rhythm of survival, and later a memory strong enough to outlast the war itself. Decades later, survivors did not speak first of battles or explosions. They spoke of steam curling into the air, of laughter returning after years of silence, of a towel pressed against their face that made them feel alive again. In war, it was not only destruction that defined lives, it was also the fragile threads of kindness that stitched them back together. And now, we turn the question to you. What do you think these stories tell us about humanity in the midst of war? Do you believe that these small mercies carried more power than the victories shouted across headlines? Share your thoughts below, because your voice adds to the living memory of history. If this story moved you, imagine how many others remain hidden in the shadows of archives, diaries, and fading testimonies. Each one waiting to be uncovered, each one reminding us that history is not only about strategies and generals, but about ordinary people caught between despair and hope. Would you want to hear more untold stories like this? Moments where humanity flickered even in the darkest places? Then don't forget to subscribe and follow along, because the past is alive with secrets still waiting to be told. History is not only what we study, it is what we feel, what we remember, and what we choose to carry into the future. If one bar of soap, one towel, one drop of warm water could change the meaning of captivity, then imagine what other details can change how we see the past. Stay curious, stay engaged, and join us on this journey into forgotten corners of history. The next story might surprise you even more.